Welcome back to the channel, Plooper Troops, and if you're new to the channel, welcome to Break the Backlog, the show where I sit down and provide my thoughts, opinions, and personal stories about a particular game that I've been playing. Today we're going to be talking about the legendary 90s horror game from Konami, Silent Hill. This was a game that I actually played and beat over on my collab channel with Backpack Comics called Dad's Fighting, where we kind of just do that classic two friends on a couch let's playing video games. We are on a hiatus right now because we got really burnt out after recording every night for like a month. But this series is actually finished, and if you want to go check it out, I will put a link to that playlist in the description below. This game was heavily recommended by Backpack as the Silent Hill series has become one of his favorite video game series of all time, and so I was really interested to see how well this game held up after all these years. This is such an interesting title, and I have really been loving this retro kick that I've been on in my personal life lately. So without any further delay, sit back, relax, grab a snack, and let's break the backlog on Silent Hill. Our journey begins with Harry Mason and his daughter Cheryl on a car ride on what looks like a mountain pass. Throughout this opening cutscene, we see many bits and pieces of the narrative that's kind of an overall puzzle that won't really make sense until we finish the game. But what we do know here is that while driving on this road, Harry is passed by a police officer on a motorcycle who will become an important character later. A short distance up the road more, Harry sees her abandoned motorcycle on the side of the road with her nowhere in sight. Shortly after this, Cheryl wakes up and smiles at her dad, and while his eyes are on her instead of what's in front of him, a girl wanders out into the road, causing Harry to swerve and crash his car. When he regains his consciousness, Cheryl is nowhere to be found. Harry then sets off to find his daughter and is attacked by two small creatures after the world seemingly shifts into some otherworldly realm, and they cause him to lose consciousness. When he wakes up, he's at a diner where he formally meets the police officer from earlier, Sybil. The two talk about the eerie and strange town that they have woken in, before they are attacked by a flying creature that Harry dispatches with a handgun provided by Sybil. He then gathers all of his gear, which include a flashlight, a knife, a map of the town, and the radio, which becomes a vital tool whose static alerts Harry to the presence of the twisted and haunting monsters that plague this town. He then sets off into the dense fog of Silent Hill once more to find his daughter and bring her back safely. This journey will prove to be anything but a simple task, as Harry will be forced to slay nightmarish creatures, solve difficult puzzles whose answers aren't always clear, and face harsh realities that will challenge his own demons and psyche. There are themes of guilt, trauma, and the limitless love and lengths that one would go to save their child. This game could come off as a bit campy or a bit goofy in some ways by today's standards, but if you're able to set aside the cringy dialogue moments and take in these themes, Silent Hill is an incredibly heavy and raw dissertation into human emotions and trauma, and how guilt, hardship, repressed memories, and what pain we have endured in our lives can eat away at us from the inside until we too become uncanny and unrecognizable to ourselves. Silent Hill's narrative is steeped in symbolism and psychological trauma that is equal parts vague and intriguing. As a person who has experienced losing a child, I can say that the desperation and anxiety that Harry feels throughout the story is valid and extremely relatable, as well as the hell that he goes through to save this person that is most precious to him. Cheryl means everything to Harry, and she's his only family after his wife has died. The isolation that Harry experiences as he travels through most of this game on his own, facing his fears and overcoming these obstacles, is such a dark and lonely place to navigate, and I felt like this perfectly mirrors the feeling of grief and the intensity of that pain after we've lost someone that we love, especially a child. This made me look back fondly on this narrative experience after sitting with my thoughts for about 2 months and letting my opinion of this game and its narrative and the storytelling kind of grow on their own. I really enjoyed getting little lore bits from Backpack throughout the adventure, and if I once again don my imagination cloak and I put myself back in 1999, yeah, uncovering parts of this story before the internet was what it is today would have been a really cool experience. Having theories that were shared between friends, taking different meanings away from the symbols, and having a unique experience where players can make what they want out of that game must have been part of what made these games hit everyone right in the feels. There are multiple endings to the game, and just in case anyone wants to play this for themselves, as usual, I decided not to talk super in depth about the actual content of the story. I did like that each of the different endings contained a different thematic song that fits with the ending experience, and the ending that we got in our playthrough wrapped up the story and left me with so many questions, thoughts, and emotions. I really enjoyed the eerie and tragic narrative and themes found in Silent Hill, and I'm excited to play the follow-up games in the series. Presentation-wise, we are going back to the year 1999, so I'll keep that in mind as we talk. Compared to games of the time, Silent Hill does look on par with other titles around this point, at least in my opinion. The game does feature a completely 3D environment, which sets it apart from other games in its genre at the time, and while this severely limited the draw distance that the PlayStation 1 could push, I do think that the choice to include a mist that covers that flaw did wonders for the tension building and add to the grim and haunting atmosphere. For the time, I can picture myself playing this game and seeing these unnamed and unidentified creatures lunging out of the fog at me, and yeah, this would be pretty creepy stuff. The town of Silent Hill is almost a monster itself, whose expansive reach is full of locations that Harry will have to descend into out of the desperation to find his daughter. Silent Hill is full of uncanny horror, the concept that something is scary because it's almost recognizable but just off enough that it's unsettling. This can be seen in the creatures like the Groaners, who resemble dogs but are twisted and hellish versions of our canine companions, or the Grey Children, who represent children ever so slightly but are grotesque and murderous monsters who wield knives and grasp desperately at Harry in an attempt to cut him down. The uncanny paintbrush that covers the canvas of this game and its unsettling palette is not limited to just the enemies, as even the world itself and the environments that Harry has to explore undergo transformation when he finds himself crossing the threshold from Silent Hill into the mangled and rust-soaked Otherworld. Locations like Midwich Elementary seemingly become ripped apart and their pieces sewn together haphazardly so that the dark and rusty hallways faintly resemble the school that Harry was just exploring, but something in them feels different, darker, more malicious. This game does so well with creating uncanny horror that aligns well with its psychological horror base that it's building from. Aside from the art style, direction, and graphics, the sounds you will find in Silent Hill will also bring you no comfort. The grunts and groans of its nightmarish creatures hunting you down, the sounds of the world around you, the static of the radio letting you know that something unpleasant is near and could be stalking you, all of these do wonders for the tense and spooky environments and serve as a great companion to the visuals. The world of Silent Hill truly looks and sounds like a nightmare come to life, which is all thanks to the sum of its parts working together to create tension and the ever-present sense of dread that psychological horror games thrive in. The music is a mix of tracks that cover everything from songs that emulate the psychological horror elements of the game that almost feel like they grate on your mind as much as the endless sea of rust that the Otherworld is soaked in, and beautiful somber songs that fit the emotional tale very well. The one glaring weakness to the sound design in Silent Hill is the voice acting, which is understandably pretty dated. The voice lines can be cringy and the delivery can just be the direct opposite of what's happening in the narrative, but it's almost in a cozy way. This was really campy and goofy, which Backpack and I had a lot of fun with. It kind of adds to the charm of the game, and there's plenty of memes and quotables that we parroted while playing just from the goofiness of the dialogue alone. But yeah, the dialogue in this game is pretty rough, and the voice direction is sometimes pretty awkward and off. Aside from some cringy voice acting and some awkward sounding voice direction, the sound in Silent Hill is relatively really strong, all things considered, which I believe is vital to crafting a solid horror atmosphere. All in all, the presentation of this game makes for a wonderful piece of horror, and while by today's standards the character models are boxy and dated, and the voice acting is pretty cringy at times, I still felt a sense of nostalgia and love for this visual style. I guess that makes sense because I love the PS1 style of modern horror indie games. Silent Hill is a third-person psychological horror game that utilizes the tank controls found in other games from the genre at this time, like Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark. These controls were used to once again create tension and a sense of confusion when running from enemies, and I think that they are successful to that effect. There were some close encounters with enemies that had me fumbling with the controls, and it did make the anxiety of being in close quarters with these enemies much more intense sometimes. I will say, however, and this is just a personal thing that I think everyone's going to vary on, I really don't like tank controls. I never have. I feel like they're clunky and kind of annoying, and while some may argue that this is their intention, they just aren't super enjoyable for me. Aside from a few isolated times when this control scheme did aid in creating scary moments, by and large I got pretty annoyed when the fixed camera angles and controls clashed, and I found myself not really vibing with this way of moving the main character. A lot of the gameplay is also focused on running around for long stretches of time just avoiding enemies between buildings that Harry explores, and so when the camera angle suddenly shifts, which I will admit, some of the camera angles in this game are very film-esque and cinematic, but the controls could become slightly confusing, and to reorient yourself to how the controls are now based on the camera's angle, which is kind of hard. The tank controls also hindered a lot of the combat experience for me as well. Now, once again, take this with a huge grain of salt because there is an argument that I just need to get good, and like I stated before, this is entirely just my opinion, and we've already established that I'm not a huge fan of this control scheme. The tank controls made the combat really clunky and hard to maneuver. For instance, I felt like the sidestep dodge was almost never useful for me, and I never could pull it off, so I just avoided using it, and I took my damage like a champ. I also found that sometimes the aiming mechanic wouldn't always lock on to an enemy, and because of my limited view with the camera, I would just be firing shots at an airborne enemy and not realizing that I was missing and wasting ammo until they flew back into frame. And as I said before, I know that this clunkiness is supposed to invoke anxiety to cause the often close quarter combat to feel even more chaotic, but for me it wasn't necessarily challenging, it was more so just hindering and kind of frustrating at times. Something that I actually did enjoy about the combat was something that I didn't discover until very late in my playthrough because of Backpack. You see, Backpack is one of my best friends that I've ever had, but Backpack also has a habit of spewing out information that he hears through the grapevine without actually verifying or witnessing this information for himself. This led Backpack to telling me that melee weapons were useless and that there was no point in using them. So I listened to my beloved friend. I mean, why would he lie to me? And I didn't use melee weapons for almost the entirety of this playthrough, literally until like the last 20% of the game. Out of curiosity one day and just trying to be funny during our recording sessions, I took out the sledgehammer and I found it to not only be effective at dispatching monsters, it became my preferred way of taking them out. Melee weapons are very easy to use, and the larger ones are pretty good at swatting multiple enemies with it, which makes the clunkiness and movement not really matter as much. Since I already couldn't sidestep, I would just sit there and trade blows with enemies until they stopped moving. This led me to running low on medical supplies throughout the latter part of my playthrough, but I had an abundance of ammunition for my firearms. So, long story short, when Backpack makes his huge declarations about anything, I will now fact check him myself. Love you, Backpack. So there are definitely things that I appreciated about the gameplay mechanics of Silent Hill, and another thing that I found to be a really strong point in the positives for this game was the game not holding your hand when it came to exploring. Having to open the map and figure out where you're at in relation to your next objective was a contextually cool attention to detail, and as Harry explores more of Silent Hill and finds clues, more red pen marks show up on the map as he takes notes and keeps track of everything. Small things like this can really be neat in my opinion because it just adds to the world building of the game, and it's reminiscent of taking those road trips back in the day with your parents and then busting out those confusing ass maps. I really never knew how my parents figured out where the hell we were going because they just looked like a sea of lines when I was a kid. This lack of hand-holding leads to another thing that I really enjoyed about the gameplay, and that is the puzzles that are found in all of the dungeon-like buildings that you'll find yourself in throughout the game. There are clues on how to solve these puzzles, and there were plenty of times we were stumped on what to do next. How anyone figured out the piano puzzle in the school and what notes to play in what order is completely beyond me. I salute you gamers of the 90s who figured this out on your own, because I have no idea how you did that. In today's gaming, we do see a lot of hand-holding and cluttered UIs that tell you where to go, what to do, and while some help is definitely appreciated, I found Silent Hill's hands-off approach a bit refreshing. I was as confused as Harry going into a lot of these puzzles and uncovering secrets which made the game more immersive. I guess that's another reason why I felt like I identified with some of the emotions I would imagine that finding yourself in Harry's shoes would be like. As a whole, the gameplay is the weakest component of this game, and it does pale in comparison to the presentation and narrative, though a lot of this is just down to me not really liking the tank controls as others might. This also isn't saying that the gameplay is objectively bad either. I think a lot of what Silent Hill has to offer works well with all the other ingredients to make a eerie and truly memorable horror setting, and that's especially so if you like tank controls. Silent Hill is touted by many people that I know as a legendary horror game that inspired the genre to be what it is today, and that it's one of the best survival horror games that contributed to the PlayStation 1 being seen as one of the best eras for survival horror of all time. After playing this game and experiencing its narrative, I can see why. Silent Hill felt like the beginning whispers of exploring human psyche and what creating tension and playing with the idea of a deeper meaning, symbolism, and emotional-centered storytelling can mean for horror video games. In an era of horror that would introduce things that are scary on the surface, external horror, Silent Hill instead centers its horror around negative human emotions that we all share and the internal darkness that many of us go through when we live through loss and trauma. While I did have issues with the gameplay and I didn't always feel like I was having fun on the physical side of the game, Silent Hill has left its mark on me and challenged me to consider my own trauma and grief. It's a game that is better than the sum of its parts, and I thoroughly enjoyed playing through this PlayStation classic. I feel like I really can't recommend this enough to those of you who enjoy artsy horror films where you get to kind of take your own meaning from things, or the PlayStation 1 graphics indie horror games like those by Puppet Combo. If you enjoy either of those or just retro games in general, you might find a lot of enjoyment here. Have you played Silent Hill? What were your thoughts on this game? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe as that greatly helps out my channel. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Peace.